Welcome, advocates, to another episode of the Leading Equity Podcast, a podcast that focuses on supporting educators with the tools and resources necessary to ensure equity at their schools. Today's special guest is Dr. Andrea Gabbadon. So without further ado, Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure is all mine, and I'm excited for today's topic because we're going to be talking about some ways that our school leaders can support our staff of color, because ultimately we want our staff to stay. So before we get into today's topic, I'd love for you to share a little bit about yourself and what you currently do.
Yes. So I'm an educator by trade. I wear a couple of different hats. I serve as a leadership coach with Teach Plus, and I lead the Philadelphia Affinity Group Network, which is a citywide network of affinity groups for educators of color. I also am a qualitative researcher and scholar and author. I wrote the book Support and Retain Educators of Color, which focuses on practical strategies that district and building leaders can implement to address working conditions to support teachers of color.
All right, well, let's do it. Let's get into it because, I work with school leaders as well. And one of the common conversations that comes up, especially when it comes to white school leaders, is, okay, I brought in some staff of color. I recognize my school demographics look a certain way, and I wanted to match as much as possible because we know the research supports that teachers and students do better when they have teachers that look like them. So it makes sense to me. And so that's what our school leaders are doing. However, they just have some challenges when it comes to maybe connecting on a relationship side of things with their staff of color, or they're like, well, I don't really know how to have these conversations outside of maybe the academic or maybe even school discipline support. They just kind of want to stick to the professional side of things, if you will. And so I'm curious, on your end, based off of your research, should school leaders be colorblind?
So that's a great question. And I address that question directly in my book, right? Should leaders ignore race or do they confront it, right? And I think at its core, what we need to recognize, any educational leader, is that schools are a microcosm of society. So all of the structural inequalities that exist outside of school walls come into schools. Right. So we like to think of schools as these really nice places where everyone is friendly, everyone gets along. But the reality is we need to confront the same issues that we want to confront outside of school in schools in order to create systems and structures that are equitable and supportive of everyone.
Okay. All right. I hear that. So you're saying that we have to recognize that what happens outside of school happens in school. That was my understanding of what your response was. But we could argue, especially a lot of parents will say, well, stick to just the math, the reading, writing, and arithmetic. How do you respond in those type of situations?
When we either create systems that exude colorblindness or our behavior itself is colorblind, that compounds pre-existing inequalities. So if we want to achieve equitable outcomes and supports, whether it's for learners or in this case, conditions that support and retain educators of color, we have to address those inequalities head on. We can't address inequalities if we're colorblind. So we have to confront those issues in a head-on manner. If not, we maintain the status quo, which in this case is going to adversely affect the educator of color in my building.
Okay. So, all right. So I think you and I are both on the same page. We have to address this head on. And I know a lot of my folks listening, and I've mentioned this before, it's like sometimes as school leaders, we might have said something with the best intentions. We can get into implicit bias. We can get into microaggressions and all those kind of things. Something has happened in the past. I've had I said the wrong thing. I got called out. And now I'm tiptoeing, or I'm afraid to have conversations outside of, again, the academic side of things. Do you have any type of tips or maybe even strategies that you can give to our school leaders who might have made a mistake in the past, or if they haven't made a mistake, they're just waiting to make that mistake? And so they're, again, afraid. Like, I agree with you, Andrea. I want to make sure that I do recognize that these things happen outside, and we have to hit it head on. What are some ways that I can address this head on?
Yeah. So you mentioned it already, right? But this idea of leaders have to interrogate their biases. I think that is the first thing. So it's not just about acknowledging that everyone has bias, but really thinking about and having the humility and the vulnerability to interrogate those things that are ingrained in us by society, by external influences, by the media, et cetera. And so, it's critical that leaders are asking themselves and interrogating, what are those things that have shaped my understanding of other people groups? What stereotypes or misinformation have I been exposed to? And how do I unlearn and potentially relearn? The second thing, and you spoke to this idea of the misstep. One thing that when I'm working with leaders is helping them unpack this idea that intent is not the same as impact. So really learning to disentangle this idea of my intentions may have been good, but how do I uncover the ways in which I have unintentionally impacted others? And what does it look like for me as a leader to take ownership and learn from that? And that requires having uncomfortable conversations. It requires accepting responsibility. But ultimately, if we have that humility to acknowledge the impact that we have, despite our best intentions, we can ultimately grow and commit to doing better in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We can definitely commit to doing better, and sometimes it's easy. I've actually had someone say, "Oh, but you're a person of color. You can engage in these conversations. It's easier for you," and I understand where they're coming from. Because I could push back and be like, well, you're coming from more level of privilege. You're more likely, folks like you are more likely to be in these positions than so we could have those kind of conversations. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, it's important to engage in these conversations, no matter what your background is. I like to use examples such as, I know I can't personally relate to some of the struggles that women experience in corporate America, in educational spaces, things like that. I cannot relate. However, I can empathize with a lot of the things that folks are coming to me about. So maybe if I am a school leader and I have a staff of color express maybe, hey, I feel like I've been discriminated against by you, or I feel as if maybe a colleague has discriminated, or a student or family, I'm dealing with this family situation and they're coming at me. I feel like it's racially based. Do you have some tips, Andrea, for school leaders who are in these type of predicaments?
Yes. And before I get into the strategies that leaders can utilize to uncover, right, some of these stories that educators of color have about marginalization or discrimination in the workplace, I want to take a step back to something powerful you mentioned about this idea of assumed cultural dexterity, right? Or this idea that educators of color themselves, or ourselves, I say ourselves as a woman of color, are able to just navigate this idea of being culturally responsive. And the reality is that being culturally responsive or culturally affirming is not an inherent trait. All of us have to learn what it is like to navigate these systems of oppression. And it's critical that white educators, understand again that this is something that we all have to learn. Now, we all come from a different starting point, but I think there's a piece around solidarity that lets us know that we're all a work in progress. Again, you spoke to being a man of color. What is it look like for you to learn about the ways in which other people experience oppression? I think that's powerful. None of us have it. We're all learning. In terms of what does it look like for educators or leaders to sit and listen to educators of color when they talk about the ways in which they've experienced discrimination or oppression. In my book, I talk about this idea of pulse meetings or information gathering. We can collect all of the data we want through quantitative surveys, and those are powerful. But one of the most powerful ways that leaders can learn what's happening to educators in their building is to ask them their stories. And so this can occur within a meeting, 15, 20 minutes, created in conditions that are comfortable to an educator of color. So for example, if the relationship between you and that educator is not there, maybe bringing in someone from the outside, or maybe having the meeting in a place that is low stress. Maybe not in your office is the best place. But you can use this meeting as a way of understanding where this person is coming from. So what are you experiencing? How can I support you? What are some of the factors, right, that allow you to feel affirmed or welcomed in this place? Where are we going wrong? What can I do differently? Now, with these questions, again, you're soliciting input, but it's critical that we're not asking educators of color to fix the ways in which they are being oppressed in buildings. We want to center their voices and their stories, but ultimately it's up to us as leaders to create conditions or to correct conditions that are oppressive to educators of color.
Can I throw out a caveat?
Sure.
I hear what you're saying. I think about compliance. my supervisor's above me. I'm a person of color. I'm in a space where I'm already feeling as if I had to prove myself or I had to work twice as hard. That's the
Mhm.
background, that's the family structure, that's what I was always taught about. Now I have my supervisor asking me to tell me, what am I doing wrong? How can I help you feel better about your situation? What do you need in order to thrive? What can tools and resources? So best intent, but the
Mhm.
impact, like you mentioned,
Mhm.
the impact to that that staff of color is, if I say to the wrong thing, if I offend this individual, I have to navigate this in a certain way. And I know a lot of folks will hold back. Bottom line.
Mhm. Mhm.
Is there maybe a way that a school leader could reinforce? No, no, seriously, I really
Mhm.
do want you to tell me how you feel. I really do want to know these things. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I smile because that's so true. There are some folks that are going to speak truth to power. And then there is the reality where, sometimes we are concerned about, the optics, or
Yeah.
there might be a fear of retaliation or fear of
Hmm.
harm. Leaders know their teachers. And so perhaps that pulse meeting may not be the best strategy to implement. If you can't have that conversation, my question is there another leader in the building, in the district that can?
Okay.
If that is not at your disposal, is there an external partner that you can work with? Institutions of higher education, consultancies, nonprofits that you can partner with to bring in and to have a landscape analysis and to work with educators in your building to figure out what's going on. How are y'all feeling? How can we support you better? If that is not possible, leaders can also create spaces like affinity groups,
Yeah.
right? Where
Hmm.
educators of color are existing in community with folks that reflect aspects of their own backgrounds, share and exchange stories, and then also kind of coalition build and collect feedback to then in turn provide their administrators. So there's a variety of ways. So my book is around strategies. To your point, we want to empower and equip leaders to think about what works best for them in their setting, considering the dynamics of their building and educators.
Wow, you hit it. You hit it right there. Those affinity groups are can be very powerful, because I'm sitting there as we're talking. I'm like, okay, you got folks that might have the imposter syndrome. You might have women that are on some angry black woman. Am I going to come across as an angry black person? We tend to use our hands a lot. Is that going to come off as aggressive? Like, these are things that we're thinking about while we're in these staff meetings or these post meetings, as you mentioned. And so I don't want to necessarily push too hard. And I love those examples or strategies that you gave. I could bring in someone that might have a better relationship, maybe a third party, or find another location, or put together those affinity groups. Any other strategies that you can think of that might be supportive in this aspect?
We can even think about low hanging fruit in terms of using, right, like surveys, but that are open ended and allowing
Mm.
time during the school day for educators to maybe fill something out. What allows you to feel welcomed in this building? How can we celebrate your success? What motivates you to come to work every day? If you could change 3 school wide priorities around how we support and retain staff, what would those things be? And so, again, providing space during a school day, the outlet of an open-ended survey where you're able to collect that data from educators, again, to really center their voices and their needs. And that's really what's at the core of this. Not what do we think educators need. Again, you spoke about color blindness, and it's not just about
Mhm.
color blindness, but in what ways are we blind to other aspects of identity that might be vulnerable to marginalization? But again, how are we creating outlets that allow everyone's voice to be heard and ultimately for them to feel welcome and included in the school culture?
At the end of the day, right? We want them to feel welcome and included. Okay, let's shift gears just a little bit. So I like this conversation. I like how we're talking about some strategies for our school leaders to develop a rapport with their folks of color. Again, ultimately, we want to retain them. I wonder if there's some things outside of maybe their school related responsibilities that I might consider as a school leader that might support maybe even the mental health, or just maybe the belongingness of a staff member of color?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of what are some outside things outside of like the academic or instructional supports, it's critical that we center educators' humanity. And what does that look like? You know, in my book, I talk about a variety of educator stories that are from real educators, but there's one story in particular which I think captures this idea of what does it look like to center someone's humanity. An educator at the time was attending like a graduate program and was working really hard. At the same time, was a full-time teacher. And she came to school one day, and her leader noticed that she was just looking really tired. And so the leader in that moment, upon looking at the educator, said, "You know what? I need you to take care of yourself. You need to be 100% to like support our kids. I trust you. You're amazing. You're in this building every day. I'm actually going to teach some of your classes today so you can go home and rest." Now, that is a very extreme example, but I love that as story because she recognizes and honors, right, what an educator has brought to the school every day and the way in which she can uplift them through things that are within her locus of control. And so what does that look like on a more practical note for leaders that can't necessarily cover classes? In what ways are you maybe protecting teachers' work time during the day so they're not taking work home? In what ways are you creating opportunities for mentorship so that educators can learn from one another? In what ways are you maybe offering opportunities for leadership and advancement and cultivating the gifts that educators are bringing into the building? Also, in what ways are you just avoiding incurring uncompensated additional labor, right? Educators of color are often called upon to be the disciplinarians, to give the PD on classroom management. If you have speakers of other language, they become the translators in the building. In what ways are you honoring their humanity by sticking to their job responsibilities and not asking them to take on all of these additional unpaid duties? And if those duties are critical, in what ways are you honoring their humanity? Maybe by compensating them for that additional labor. So again, small things that we can do to refine working conditions, again, to center who our educators are.
You know, I've been doing a lot of research and having a lot of conversations on that in regards to the kind of the tokenization of a lot of our staff members. Like you said, they're always the one that has to deal with all the discipline. They're ones that, like you said, have to talk about how to be a culturally responsive teacher or how to classroom management and all these things. They could be a stellar English teacher. They could be a stellar math teacher. Those professional development opportunities only go to the white staff. And so the staff of color get all the quote unquote culture related type of, and so they get pigeonholed. You pull up their resume, they pull up their CV, all it says is diversity related stuff. And then all their colleagues and their counterparts are getting all of the other jobs because they can't do it. And so I see it all the time. And it's happened to me. It's like, I tell people, look, I'd love to teach your class, but I can do other things outside of just your diversity class. Like I've been a principal, I've been a teacher, I've done special ed, I've done this, I've done that. I can also excel in that as well. But when we get to a place, and I love that you brought this up because I just want to give this reminder to our school leaders. I hear what folks are saying. I hear what I see you have the best intentions, but don't limit your staff of color or even your LGBTQ plus community folks to just those topics when it comes to professional development.
And, again, you talk about what are ways that we can, what are the things outside the academic or instructional supports? In what ways, if you're not able to, well, one, do leaders know the areas where their educators want to improve? What are the areas where they want to grow? Are you pointing them to opportunities for them to excel? Are you connecting them with leadership opportunities inside the district, outside the district? If you know that they have an interest in a particular pedagogy, can you connect them with a resource that will push them? Again, acknowledging the gifts, the talents that they bring, the expertise that they bring to the table outside of just managing, and really not even managing. What we're asking folks to do is to police Black and brown bodies. And so we need to really think beyond that, because at the end of the day, Black and brown educators are coming to our buildings. They want to work with kiddos that reflect their backgrounds and support all kiddos. Really, in what ways are we encouraging them and what brings them to teaching in the first place? Not pushing them out because of our assumptions about what they bring to the profession.
Say that one more time. Not because of what?
The assumptions that we have about them. So.
Girl, all right. Now I tell you what, that right there. I mean, but it hit hard. That hit hard because again, we do make a lot of assumptions. We just assume that someone's going to be the spokesperson for this community or this identity. Oh, they have lived experiences, and oh yeah, we'll call Johnny or Mister whoever, Miss whoever, because they'll love to speak about it. And again, that person never gets any other opportunities. That's the only time that they get to speak is for those based off of those assumptions that you make. So I like to tell my school leaders, I tell them, look, the conversation, rather than assuming, you should ask a question such as, has this been your experience, or are you open to these conversations or open to doing this professional development? And if so, what areas of focus would you like to present on? See, now I'm putting it back on that staff member. So I've asked him, hey, are you interested in presenting and what areas of focus, as opposed to just assuming that they're all the culture responsive? That's that person. Do you have anything similar that you do as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that should occur in the onboarding process, right? What are they proud about? What are they most interested in? It can also come to play when we're doing, evaluations, not just jumping to, you need to work on Danielson domain XYZ, but what went well in this lesson? What are you most excited about? What do you perceive as next steps? How can I support you? What do you want to learn more about? We often think about, the ways in which we need to kind of hone in on maybe perceived deficits or things that need to improve. And we all have areas that we need to improve, but we often overlook, one, opportunities for educators to name their areas of brilliance, and two, think about how do we strengthen those areas. And so again, I think just connecting and asking educators outright the areas that they want to grow can be powerful.
Just ask. I know some folks they're afraid. They're afraid to ask these questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think Golden Muhammad says it so well. She uses this idea of like genius, right? What is your area of genius? The teacher leaders that I work with and train, like, how can we learn from your genius? What are you amazing at that we can all learn from? What do you bring to our collective or our cohort? And to ask those questions, not in a way to, burn folks out and again, kind of pull on them. Oh, you're going to give this PD on this subject, but no, what are you awesome at? And how can I support you in fueling that passion?
Got it. I like it. All right. So I'll tell you this. I mean, you've provided a lot of mic drop moments and some very, and I've learned a lot, especially, I mean, you hit home with a lot of your comments. And I think that folks that are listening to this can find your information valuable. And of course, I always encourage folks to get the book as well. Support and retain educators of color, 6 Principles for Culturally Affirming Leadership. But I'd love for you, Andrea, to take us home with maybe any final words of advice you want to provide to our listeners.
I would loop back to the comment that I made in the beginning around schools are a microcosm of society. It's critical that we acknowledge that, just like we all aspire to create a more just society, not just for our current generation, but for future generations. It's critical that we do so in our schools. So if we want to create more equitable outcomes and opportunities for our babies, our students, that starts with the working conditions that we're creating for educators. And so for leaders, asking those hard questions around what are our biases? In what ways do we disentangle intent versus impact? Asking those hard questions is the beginning of a necessary work. And so I'm excited for educators and leaders who want to engage in that work. Kudos to you, you're getting started, but it is a road that requires partnership and learning from and centering ultimately the teachers of color that we seek to uplift in this profession.
At the end of the day, can't be colorblind, right?
Not at
And
all.
that trickles down to your community as well, not just your staff, but your students as well. Especially a lot of our schools, we see a lot more students of color within our student demographics than our staff, and so we definitely don't want to be colorblind in that realm either. So you brought the fire today. Thank you so much. If we have some folks that want to connect with you, what's the best way to reach you online?
Yes. So I can be found at www.ilmconsultinggroup.org. I can also be found on LinkedIn, Andrea Gabbadon. Excited to connect with folks online around the book and otherwise equity-focused initiatives that they're doing in their districts and buildings to support and retain educators of color.
All right, Andrea, it has truly been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, likewise.